this university that was founded on the Buddhist principles of peace, human rights, and the sanctity of life, to be kicking off our Nobel Seminars here today with these wonderful, illustrious guests is so special, and it's just absolutely validated everything we do here to see how quickly the seats filled for this event. So thank you all for coming. We're excited to have you. My name is Mary Patrick Kavanaugh. Now I would like to invite our president, Dr. Edward Fiesel, to welcome the event and all of you.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to a very special event here at SUA this afternoon. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Asle Toje to Soka University of America. Welcome, Dr. Toje. Dr. Toje will deliver a keynote address later, and then have a conversation with our own distinguished adjunct professor, Alexander Harang. And Alexander, thank you. Much of this, and so thank you for all your efforts in that regard. And the theme of tonight, the important topic, is the threat of nuclear weapons. And while SUA is only a little over 20 years old, for those who were able to tour our new Soka Heritage Hall before this event, you were able to see we have a rich, long history dating all the way back to the early 20th century with the father of Soka education, Mr. Tsunesaburo Makaguchi. Mr. Makaguchi, an educational reformer and also Buddhist leader, was persecuted by the Japanese military government, and he was imprisoned and during the Second World War and died in prison. His student, Josei Toda, a math teacher and Buddhist leader, was also falsely imprisoned during the war, but he survived and he was released in July 1945. A little over a decade later, Mr. Toda in 1957 made the famous declaration denouncing nuclear weapons and calling for their abolition. At that time, Mr. Toda shared, quote, "Why do I say this? Because we, the citizens of the world, have an inviolable right to live," unquote. Mr. Toda saw nuclear weapons as a clear threat to the sanctity of life of every person and living being. His disciple and our university founder, Daisaku Ikeda, has continued to respond to Mr. Toda's call to action. In all his annual peace proposals to the United Nations, which he began in 1983, Mr. Ikeda has addressed the important topic of the threat of nuclear weapons and made various proposals on the issue. Most recently, in July of last year, ahead of the 10th Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons Review Conference, and on January 11th this year, Mr. Ikeda has made proposals on no first use of nuclear weapons. Given this history and lineage, we are very honored to be holding this important event, launching the Nobel Seminars at SUA on important collaboration between SUA and the Norwegian Nobel Institute. SUA Distinguished Adjunct Professor Alexander Harang is head of politics at No to Nuclear Weapons. He is the former leader of the Norwegian Peace Association, has served as director of the Norwegian Peace Council, has been the national representative of Norway to the International Peace Bureau over the last 2 decades. Harang has also been political advisor to the Standing Committees on Foreign Affairs and Defense to the Norwegian Parliament from 2005 to 2009. Among his scholarly works are Small but Lethal Small Arms Munitions and the Small Arms Treaty and the Peace Nation. He is currently teaching a learning cluster here at SUA entitled the Nobel Peace Prize in Nuclear Disarmament. In fact, today Dr. Toje visited the class and the students were able to present their nominations for this year's Nobel Peace Prize, and Dr. Toje evaluated them and gave them feedback. So thank you very much, Dr. Toje. Dr. Asle Toje is the deputy leader of the 5-member Norwegian Nobel Committee, which selects laureates for the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the former research director at the Norwegian Nobel Institute in Oslo. After completing his PhD in Cambridge, Dr. Toje has lectured and taught at universities in Europe and beyond. Among his scholarly works are The European Union as a Small Power, published by Macmillan, Will China's rise be peaceful? The Rise of a Great Power in Theory, History, Politics, and the Future, published by Oxford University Press, and The Causes of Peace, What We Know Now. Dr. Toje is a syndicated columnist and a frequently used pundit in the international media. To our great benefit and delight, Dr. Toje has been staying on campus, meeting with students, faculty, and staff for the last several days. And this afternoon, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Toje with us, as we will all truly get a glimpse inside the Nobel Peace Prize. But first, please join me in welcoming Alexander Harang to share a few remarks and introduce Dr. Toje.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I will keep my remarks very, very, very short, because the main thing here is to introduce this very great man. This man, Dr. Toje. We are at SUA, and as you all know, we have 3 core values here. It's about courage, it's about wisdom, and it's about compassion. And I'm proud to tell you that this man has all of them, and he's proven them just over the last 5 days, as President Ed Wiesel just told you, when Toje has been on campus, and I've had the greatest privilege of having him teaching our students in my learning cluster about nuclear weapons and about the Nobel Peace Prize and how these things goes together. It's been just a fantastic experience, and I'm so grateful for everything you've done for us and for your presence here. But just so you guys know a little bit about who we're talking about. As a fellow Norwegian, I'm from the same country as this man. So I know the celebrity of this guy. He is one of the greatest public intellectuals in our country. He's a true national treasure. And so that goes for the wisdom, doesn't it? If you are a true intellectual and you like to share your wisdom like this man, okay, then we have one. But he's also a very courageous man. There's not very many people who have this position as part of that group of 5 that actually make the decision on who is to get this year's Nobel Peace Prize. That is out there in the open, giving its analysis on world affairs, constantly, week after week, in public debate. That takes a lot of courage, and he has it. And compassion. When I see how he has been working together with our students, seeing absolutely everyone for who they are and helping them in the most intimate way you can help students in their own intellectual growth, you see a true man of compassion. So thank you, Asle, for carrying all these 3 values of SUA with you, and we're very excited to hear what you have to say to us now.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for welcoming me to Soka University. And just a small add-on to the introductory remarks. You have to keep in mind that Norway is a very small country. There are only about 5 or 6 of us. So I'm honored, but please keep that in mind. Coming here to Soka University has been a homecoming of sorts. It has been such a joy to engage with the students, with the faculty, and to be at the campus that bears the name of so many Nobel Peace Prize laureates. And I'd like to share with you some comments, some remarks on Alfred Nobel and the Nobel Peace Prize. Alfred Nobel had a lonely childhood. He was sickly and he was difficult. He was one of these kids that many would have given up on. Through education, through educating himself, Alfred Nobel became one of the greatest inventors of his age. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the idea of supercycles, but we're in California, so it might interest some. You know, the first sort of economic supercycle was associated with the advent of the steam engine, created vast amounts of wealth. In this country, you know, the railway, this was the age of the railway barons. The second superstructure was connected to a new technology, the railway. This was the steel revolution. Then there is a switch. The steel revolution is coming to an end. Something else is going to take its place. Enter Alfred Nobel. This is going to be the age of chemistry. Alfred Nobel, in his lifetime, he has no fewer than 355 patents. He was an inventor. He invented dynamite, and in the process became a very wealthy man. But he didn't enjoy wealth for its own sake. Alfred Nobel was a man who, throughout his life, kept on reading, studying philosophy, going to the theater, had a vast library. He was a full-bodied, a full-spirited man. And when his life was drawing to an end, he drew up his famous last will and testament. You have to keep in mind that this guy was Bill Gates rich. He was ridiculously rich. He was known as the most eligible bachelor around because he was not married. So everybody were wondering what's going to happen with all that money. Well, 5 awards, you know them all. Nobel Prizes in physics, chemistry, physiology or medicine, literature, and peace. And I have had the pleasure of being, I said pressure, that was a Freudian slip, it's a pressure. I meant to say pleasure, but it's not really, it's much more pressure. To be part of the committee that every year we get around 350 nominations that we have to treat seriously, each individual one. And I thought it was such a pleasure to be with the students of Soka University. And I'm not sure, I see there are some of you that might not be students here. I'm sure that you are a student, obviously, but not everybody might be a student here. So I just thought I'd tell you my experience with the Soka students. They are brilliant. I've taught at universities around the world, and the caliber of your students is magnificent. And the caliber has very much to do with the way people are educated at this university, which is distinct. There is an idea, there's a philosophy driving this university. And at the core of this philosophy, the philosophy of Daisaku Ikeda is peace. Peace within, peace without. And when the students were presenting to me, you know, their nominations, I was a little bit sort of uncertain about what to do with this. And I'm happy to say that all 12 of the suggestions from the students were stellar, excellent suggestions. And I've decided to take each one of these proposals for the Nobel Peace Prize and nominate in my own name, telling and I will tell my fellow members of the committee that I am nominating these 12 organizations and individuals in the name of the students here at Soka University of America. Thank you so much for the work that you have done, Professor Harang. Ed, you're doing a great job. And thank you. Alfred Nobel, in his testament, he writes about 3 criteria for whoever is going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. The sky behind it is for those who does efforts to the greatest benefit of mankind. That goes for all the Nobel Awards. This is an award that carries with it the hope of humanity. It's the hope that we, through our innovativeness, through our industry, through science, through technology, will improve ourselves as a species, and at the same time keeping the devil at bay, keeping this outsized capacity for aggression that is a trait of our species at bay. And Alfred Nobel was concerned about this, so he put out 3 criteria. Those who work for fraternity amongst nations, those who work for the reduction or abolishment of standing armies, and those who promulgate the spreading of peace congresses. In the tradition of the Nobel Peace Prize that has been given out every year, well, not every year, but pretty much every year since 1901. This has created three great traditions within the Nobel Peace Prize. One is those who work for a better organized world, for the nations and the individuals of this world to find ways to resolve our differences without resorting to violence. The second is disarmament. And the third category are the peacemakers. And I thought I'd have a couple of remarks on disarmament, because this is where the thought of Daisaku Ikeda, the spirit of Soka University, and the spirit of the Nobel Peace Prize come together. In this one case, disarmament. Because no single issue has been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize more often than this nuclear disarmament. And I've been talking to the students about my personal engagement for peace. And I've been honest, I came by a different road than many in the peace movement, in a different road than Professor Harang here. My background is from war studies. And for the longest time as a student, I was a defender of nuclear weapons. What's not to like? It creates stability, created stability during the Cold War. What's not to like? Keeping the great powers from going to war against each other. As the Cold War came to an end, to my horror, I began to realize that in a multipolar world, it will become increasingly difficult to avoid the first use of nuclear weapons. And once nuclear weapons have been used, we're in an uncharted territory. Uncharted territory that could lead to the end of civilization. Probably not to the end of humanity, but it could lead to the end of civilization. A recent research paper found that even a small nuclear war fought with 8 to 12 nuclear bombs, the size that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would create catastrophic climate change that would kill hundreds of millions of people through failed harvests. This is the weapons that we have made. These are the weapons we need to abolish. Have we been successful? Not yet. But let's count our blessings. I think through the efforts, through the peacemakers, through men and women of goodwill, we have been able to avoid the worst outcome so far. Now it's our generation's turn. And I find it intensely meaningful to speak to the young people, these students at Soka University, and try to hand over this most important of challenges, the task of nuclear disarmament. At Soka University, many of the laureates that I myself hold in the highest esteem, people like Martin Luther King, Linus Pauling, are honored at this university. And it gives me such hope. And I'd like to end by commenting on, it's sometimes said that the Nobel Peace Prize is the most prestigious award in the world. Well, at least according to the dictionaries. And isn't that something that speaks well about us as a species? Wouldn't that be the first thing that we would tell if we were ever visited from a planet in a galaxy far, far away? That on this planet, the most prestigious award is a Peace Prize. And I believe that the education that you offer here at Soka University are creating a new generation of peace lovers, peace activists, and full-spirited young people who will go into the world and hopefully carry out the great mission of Alfred Nobel, the great mission of Daisaku Ikeda, this hope to be acting for the greatest benefit of mankind. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Toje. You have outlined quite a bit of the structure you're working within as a Nobel Peace Prize committee member. as a deputy chairman. But what about the outside? Well, as we can see in our program today, we're living in dangerous times. There's something special about these times. We have heard very many times, especially over the year 2022, that the actual threshold for using nuclear weapons is getting dangerously low. Why is this happening, Dr. Toje? What is your analysis? Why is it that we are living in dangerous times, and why is that nuclear weapons is now pretty much on top of the peace agenda?
Well, thank you for the question. You know, for the longest time we have been living in an afterthought. We have been living in the age after the Cold War. We didn't really have any good prefix or postfix to come up with a good slogan for the times we're living in, but it's quite clear that the post-Cold War is over. And in this new reality, the hopes that we had, and some of you will remember the hopes we had when the Berlin Wall fell, the hopes of a world determined by cooperation and prosperity for all, seems to have fallen back into great power rivalry and great power conflict. Currently there is a horrendous war going on in Ukraine. Threats have been made for the actual use of nuclear weapons on numerous occasions. So far, over 100,000 young Ukrainian men and 100,000 young Russian men have sacrificed their lives in the dirt fighting over provinces in Ukraine. And there's no sign that this conflict is going to let up. But at the same time, we see sparks and conflicts springing up around the world. We see it we see it in Syria, we see it in Iran, we see it over in the South China Sea, and we see a tendency towards the militarization of diplomacy. The United States has made a decision, one that we will live with the consequences of. I'm not for or against, I'm just saying that we're going to live with the consequences. The United States has decided to balance against China. It's a new tone. The leader of NATO was in Tokyo yesterday with quite fiery language directed at China. This can only lead to greater animosity and conflict. And the war in Ukraine, it's difficult to see how this is going to end. There are preciously few peacemakers out there. In my own country, it's almost tantamount to treason to even suggest that there might be a negotiated solution. It scares the heck out of me. It really does, because you have to go back to almost World War I to find similar enthusiasm for war. The fools, you know, in all over Europe and in parts of this country, everybody's, you know, getting ready for the big offensive. There's going to be an offensive, and everybody assumes that this is going to be this stellar moment where the Russians fold and the Ukrainians win. But wars are rarely like that. Wars have a tendency to spiral into ever more industrial killing. So we find ourselves in a most difficult place right now.
So tensions are rising. We have several new arms races ongoing. And we have, of course, this horrible war in Ukraine. But what exactly is it about that war that makes the nuclear issue so much more important? You said, you know, there's been several threats. Okay. But what is it that you're really afraid of? When you're saying that this keeps you awake at night, what is it that you're seeing? What is the scenario that you can foresee in Ukraine which will be so damaging that it can actually break the nuclear taboo?
The world is made up by powers that we do not control. The problem for us in the West is that we got used to quite quickly that we are it's the Western bloc that determines the rules of the game. It's our agenda, it's the world's agenda. We got used to that really quick. Now we're not used to this idea. And it was articulated by the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. You know, in the plainest terms, I think we can all agree there is a red line. If it's crossed, the Russians will use nuclear weapons. The problem is we have no idea where that red line is. But we're pushing ever closer towards the red line. And please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not saying that anybody should give up and give the Russians whatever they want. I'm just saying that this war has the potential to unleash a catastrophe on mankind. And that should be taken into consideration when we are discussing this crisis. So maybe we should be less gleeful about the Russians not being able to get their act together, and more concerned about what might come if a red line that we do not know is crossed and nuclear weapons are used. I can assure you that even in this country, I'm quite sure the American president doesn't know what he would do. We would just be in a different country. We would be in a much more perilous situation. And I put it to you, dear audience, do you feel that the quality in the global leadership is of a carrot that is right for this kind of decisions? Are we equipped with the sort of leaders that we should have to make a decision about the future of mankind and nuclear war in a split second? Because once nuclear weapons are used, we know there's a ticking clock. The generals will be in the room, they will have their opinions, and things might get really, really horrible really quick.
Now that's certainly, that is certainly a big worry. I mean, if you look at the situation, you have more than 12,700 nuclear warheads out there, and you have thousands of them on hair-triggered alert, meaning that these leaders you're talking about, let's use the American example. I mean, if the Russians are firing off a missile, you will have less than 15 minutes to make up your decision, whether you're firing back or not. Now, a nuclear exchange just of those nuclear weapons that is on high alert right now would mean more than 1,000 nuclear weapons fired at each other, which is, of course, an immense catastrophe for everything. But that makes me think about one element when it comes to the leaders, as you say. Because you are actually one of the few who's had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Putin himself. Now, what you said about world leaders and thinking about your experience meeting him, to what extent would you trust him with the big red button?
I did have the pleasure of having dinner with the Russian president. It was a weird dinner. But we were speaking in German because he's more comfortable speaking German, and it was one of those dinners where he was just laying it down on me about all the wrong things the West had done against Russia, all the wrong things Norway had done against Russia, and I was trying, to be polite and courteous while not conceding anything really. But it was weird. It was really weird, because you're sitting down on this great banquet, like you have cutlery like spreading out, Like, I know some of the students have been practicing, like you start on the outside and move towards your plate. But anyway, so I'm sitting there, and then the president comes, and and the dinner is being served, and I get this luscious, beautiful meal, and Mr. Putin gets a Tupperware box. He will not eat anything that is put before him. He's afraid of being poisoned, so he eats his dinner out of Tupperware. He will not. He brings his own water, and I guess that maybe says something about the spirit in Russia. On the one hand, we have a tendency to view the Russian president as almighty. His word is law. At the same time, he's a man who can't, eat the food that his own people are putting in front of him. So, yeah, he's an interesting guy.
Yeah, well, if that's the level that scares you, I sure wouldn't be very happy with having, that finger at that close to that big red button at the time. But let's think about, okay, going from that scenario where we can clearly see that we are going from a unilateral world order to a multipolar world order, and there has been grand shifts, as you say, which is deeply worrying. Turning back to the Nobel Peace Prize, what can you guys do about it? What is it that the Nobel Peace Prize in itself can contribute with? How can the Nobel Peace Prize help us, let's say, increase the threshold for actual use of real nuclear weapons these days?
Well, let me be clear about that. You know, the Nobel Peace Prize does not create peace. It's a prize that is given to people for their efforts towards promoting peace. So let's not, you know, get too excited. But the Nobel Peace Prize can, on occasion, be a thumb on the scale. It is a chance to direct the world's attention towards an individual, towards a cause. Because when the Nobel Peace Prize is announced in Oslo, all the world's media are there. It's a global event. And this is our chance to draw attention to the work of individuals and institutions towards peace. And as I mentioned in my prepared remarks, the Nobel Peace Prize has been given about a dozen times. The students in the class will understand why I say about a dozen times, because some of the laureates have more than one agenda, to put it that way. But by returning to the topic of nuclear disarmament on a regular basis, the Nobel Committee has remained steadfast in our commitment towards nuclear disarmament. The fact that that has not yet happened does not dampen our spirits. And I think in the years to come, the Nobel Peace Prize will continue to be a thorn in the side of the powerful, of the authoritarians, and a beacon of hope for those who are working towards a more peaceful world, a world where each nation and each country and each individual can live in prosperity and harmony and peace. That's our common goal, right? This is what we want for ourselves. This is what we want for others, and this is what we shall achieve. We shall achieve that. We are not going to give up on this.
So, if you look back at those prizes, let's say those dozen of prizes that has been awarded to people who came up with some solutions, right? That were deemed to, or some possible solutions, how to get to the abolishment of nuclear weapons, how do we disarm, how do we make sure that future generations don't have to live with these things. Are there any of those efforts that they got the prize for that you would say is relevant for today's situation? Is there any lessons we can learn from those awards given for this purpose?
I like to think that the anti-nuclear movement has been indispensable in creating our greatest shield against nuclear war, and that is the nuclear taboo. The nuclear taboo is our greatest shield. You only have to go back to the 1950s when an American general, General MacArthur, just wrote to the president and said, I'm going to need some nuclear bombs. I'm the general, I'm in charge here, this is how we win this war. And the American President Truman said, no, that is not a decision for the generals. This is too important, I'm going to keep that decision on my desk. That was the end of MacArthur's reign as commander-in-chief for the forces. And ever since that, I believe that there is a thought in the heads of decision makers who are put when they've come close to using nuclear weapons. For instance, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is that taboo, this sense that if you do this, the world is not going to be the same, and in history will not judge you kindly. That there are people around the world who will speak out against such an action, who will not hold their peace. And this has everything to do with the destruction that was visited upon two cities in Japan, Nagasaki and Hiroshima. For some years, it took a while for the stories from these cities to trickle out. And in these years, there was great enthusiasm for nuclear weapons. What's not to like? You know, the biggest bomb ever. And then the stories start coming out from the people who first came to the smoky deserts of these cities to see the civilians that have been afflicted by a nuclear weapon. And the result, in every case, was sheer horror at the destructive potential of these weapons. and a realization that these weapons cannot be used. And who were the first people who articulated this? It was the men and women who invented the bomb. Albert Schweitzer was the first Nobel laureate. He's the first in the tradition of nuclear Nobel Prizes. And it's so interesting to see, because the guy was given the Nobel Peace Prize for his humanitarian works. He was a medical doctor, he had his mission in Africa, he was a great intellectual, a Nobel laureate, respected around the world. But in those days it wasn't so easy to travel, so it took 2 years before he came to Oslo to give his address. In those 2 years, something had changed. Something had changed in Schweitzer's heart. He had been corresponding with Einstein, with Bertrand Russell, and his Nobel address was about nuclear weapons. So he blindsided us. We had given him the award for one thing, and he came and spoke about another. Ever since then, people like Albert Schweitzer, and dare I say, Daisaku Ikeda, have been leading the charge towards ridding the world of these weapons. It's not an easy task. The counterforces are strong. I subscribe to many of the concerns of the nuclear powers, but I believe that any problem that has been created by humans can be resolved by humans. And we should keep that insight close to our hearts.
Absolutely. Let me just ask you one short, small, little question, which is extremely difficult to answer, before all the rest of you get to ask all the questions you need. Okay, so it's a nuclear taboo, which is the big thing. That's the big thing with all those prizes, right? And today we're living in a world where the chance of nuclear war is much higher than in a very, very long time. Many people will even say that it is a higher chance of nuclear war now than ever before. Okay, so let's get technical then. What do you do? What are the efforts that you see that the world needs right now? What is it that you and the other four in the committee are discussing when it comes to nuclear security, how to avoid a nuclear war? What are the concrete efforts that you're looking after, that you're seeking for?
Well, it's not a difficult question. No first use. No first use. The nuclear powers should pledge openly to each other and to the world that they will not use nuclear weapons first. That is where we're at.
That's where we're at. Okay. So calming down the system by declaring that you will not use your nuclear weapons first. And then what comes next? We still have those weapons, right?
Then starts the process of arms reduction. I think that any sane person would agree that even if you subscribe to the logic of nuclear weapons, even if you subscribe to the idea that great powers need to have a weapon of such destruction that they will forever be safe from invasion and subjugation, even if you subscribe to that, you will agree that there are far too many nuclear weapons in existence today. There is no need to have a planet-destroying capacity. So we need to bring down the numbers. And I think one of the saddest thing, and one that unfortunately I didn't detect myself in the 1990s. Some of you will remember the 1990s. It was so much news in the 1990s, so much going on. There was, a coup and a revolution every day of the week. And we failed to see the opportunity that was associated with the decommissioning of many of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons. Unfortunately, this country didn't follow up. It was an opportunity. Had the American president said, we will make deep cuts in the American arsenal correspondent to the cuts in the Soviet arsenals and bring the numbers down to a reasonable level, we would be in a different place than we are today. Now, we're entering into this perilous phase of human history with all the weapons from the Cold War intact. And unfortunately, much of the mindset of the Cold War intact. That's why I think it's so important that each one of you here in this auditorium keep in mind that you matter. At the end of the day, it is often the speech of one man, of one woman, at the right time, who's present, that will change the course of history. We saw it during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I bet JFK was happy his brother was in the room, because his brother was the one who said, we're not doing this. This was what the Japanese did to us at Pearl Harbor. We're not that kind of country. America will not use nuclear weapons first. I can promise you he was the only one in the room of that mind, but he persuaded his brother. I think we're all glad for that. So keep that in mind. Your opinions matter. Even, you know, in a casual conversation with a friend, to be an advocate for the cause of peace and to take your reasonings and your logic, the better angels of our nature, as President Lincoln famously called it, and let that be your guiding star. Because we don't know who of you will be the one to save the world, but I hope that should the day come when a leader in one of the great powers is considering, is close to pushing the proverbial button, there will be somebody in the room, somebody with the soul and understanding of the path that we have traveled as a species. Somebody who loves humanity. Humanism is the core credo of this university. Please, protect your humanism, spread your humanism, because a truthful word can never be spoken in vain.
Thank you so much for a most inspiring conversation, Dr. Dyer. And now, Mary Patrick.
I have to exhale, because that was an astonishing talk and enlightening and inspiring. Thank you so much. So I am going to be the room monitor for Q&A. We have two students. Raise your hand with microphones. There we go. Zara back there and Romy. There we are. Okay, so my one request, or our request of you, is to keep comments brief and to keep focused on the question. And we may need some help from some of the audience members to take the microphone and pass it down the aisle. And when you're done with your question, pass it back for our students to deliver it to the next questioner. So what questions do we have from the audience? All right, we have a question back there. Prince, would you like to bring the...
Thank you. I like your comment about the taboo as what is holding it together now, and the idea of a no fresh start. But do you think that we need to couple that also with a no regime change agenda? Because if you think about Syria, if you think about even North Korea, and Putin saying, my red line is if you try to initiate a regime change. So will an anti-regime change agenda be also a good first step?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a dangerous question, especially in the West. But you know, like let's not forget the great strength of democracy. The great strength of democracy is our capacity to acknowledge our mistakes and remedy them. For a while, Western countries were occupied with coming up with innovative arguments for invading countries. You know, we invaded Afghanistan because to fight terror. So terror was so important that sovereignty didn't matter. We bombed Libya to stave off a genocide. The responsibility to protect, we call that. We used force against Serbia over Kosovo, again without a UN mandate, to stave off the ethnic cleansing of a region. And every single one of these arguments have been, oh well, we invaded Iraq, and that was because of weapons of mass destruction. And every one of these arguments have been paraded out by the Russians in defense of their unlawful attack on Ukraine. They're out there, you know, to forestall the genocide. They're out there to secure, you know, the nuclear facilities. They're out there to defend their population against ethnic cleansing. Of course, it persuades no one. But here's a problematic thought. I think most people around this audience are completely on board with confronting Russia over its unlawful war against Ukraine. I think most of us are on board with supporting Ukraine in its hour of need. At the same time, I think we need to look at the inconvenient truth, and that is that 114 countries around the world are not supporting the sanctions at all. Why is that? I can promise you this is the most unwelcome discussion possible to have in the White House or in the Prime Minister's office in Norway. It's only 5 of us, so that's my sister. Because our power of attraction, the so-called soft power of the democracies, has withered, and it has very much to do with the savage wars of peace that we have been waging. 270,000 Afghans died during the 20 years that we were, well, I wouldn't say, well, we never called it an occupation, but we were there with guns. And how much are we discussing the fate of all those civilians who died in the Malays? The millions of people that were driven from their homes in Iraq, the hundreds of thousands that were killed in acts of war. And I think that we need to find our way back to an ethos in the West that puts a premium on peace. And yes, to your question, I think, and it gives me no joy to say it, but I think the UN Charter is right. I think that sovereignty should be protected, even the sovereignties of regimes and states that we revile. And I think that we should be grown up enough to acknowledge that the best intentions we had in these wars, our interventions, was a plethora of flower language. We never called it a war. It was always an intervention, and you would normally be humanitarian, you know. I think that we need to owe up to the fact that you cannot foster democracy or peace by invading countries. And I think that is something that we need to own up to. And we're quite far away from doing that, I have to admit.
Very good.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. You talked about how it's important for countries to pledge, all countries for unified pledge for non-first use and the slow reduction of nuclear weapons. But I believe in this current society, realists say that countries will work in their self-interest and there is inherent distrust within nations or with other nations. Is it truly possible for countries to be able to trust each other to follow this pledge of non-first use and the reduction of nuclear weapons? And if it is possible, how long does that continue? Considering the current mistrust within North Korea, the potential dissensions with China and other nations, and the unknowns of kind of Middle East countries that are being put into the news. And yeah, I was just wondering, is it truly possible to kind of shift away from just this perspective that many governments and international bodies have? Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. You mentioned North Korea. There are two nuclear states that are in a very special category. Israel, because of the Holocaust, and North Korea, because they're batshit crazy. And I don't think that this sort of recent argument would cut much ice into Pyongyang. But look to Asia. Two of the Asian nuclear powers, China and India, already have no first use policies in place. Both of these countries have small nuclear arsenals, nowhere near the capacity to end civilization. And I think that when you look at the non-proliferation treaty that was agreed in 1968, the nuclear powers agreed that they would work towards the abolishment of nuclear weapons. Well, they haven't really lived up to that promise so far, have they? And I think that it's a reasonable demand on behalf of all the other countries around the world that we can demand that from the nuclear powers. I think it's a reasonable demand to say no first use. But again, I think we need to mobilize the nuclear taboo. We need to mobilize the citizens and the populations of this globe. And we need to alert our fellow men to the great danger that we're living in. Because during the Cold War, everybody were afraid of nuclear war. Everybody were conscious of the consequences of nuclear war. This was a talking point. It manifested itself in popular culture, in great peace movements, in demonstrations. It all abated to this point where a war is fought in Ukraine, and you can see on Russian television the gleefulness that commentators are presenting little sort of graphics about how Russia could turn the United Kingdom into a smoking desert, you know, and this is Saturday night entertainment. You know, we could destroy a country. What fun! And you see it with the leaders around the world have become much more cavalier in threatening with their nuclear weapons. This country had a president that was talking about that his button was bigger than another leader's button. Is vulgar. No leader during the Cold War would have been so cavalier in referring to nuclear war. No leader would have done that. So we need to equip ourselves with better leaders in the democracies. You know, like we need to start electing people that we feel are up to the job. And it's a difficult job. It's not for everyone, but let's try to find somebody who's able to do that. And I think we should also put pressure on our leaders in whatever country we're in to make this demand of no first use. And I'm really happy to see that the anti-nuclear movement is now rallying behind. Daisaku Ikeda just issued his peace proposal for 2023, and the core of the peace proposal is this: no first use. So there is a momentum around this cause, and I hope it will succeed. I will certainly do my best.
Thank you.
Here we go. Since they're bringing you a mic, we are having some difficulties.
Max doesn't need a mic.
So it's me again. I am part of Alex and his chief learning cluster, and during our trip on the ride towards Monterey, we had this discussion about how 9 countries could turn into 13 countries. So if Iran, right now the hot topic is Ukraine and Russia, and behind that there's also Iran that is also doing research, starting its research for nuclear weapons. And what do you think is perhaps solutions to avoid such things? In the past, we had the JCPOA with the United States and other 5 countries, but it failed because Iran kind of cheated with the IAEA. So what do you think are possible solutions to avoid Iran progressing their research? Because they could also go to Egypt and all other countries nearby, which will make more proliferation happen. So what do you think is perhaps solution, and how could Nobel Peace Prize be an influence to this global problem? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Max. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Just a point of fact. It wasn't the Iranians who torpedoed the JCPOA. It was President Trump who torpedoed this agreement. And while I can agree with the logic of Trump, while I can understand why he was unhappy with the deal as it had been agreed, he broke the cardinal rule of international politics. A country has to abide by its own word. You can't break treaties. You can't break your word, not in international politics. It's not a domestic scene. A country is as good as its word. And by pulling out of the agreement, it made it more or less impossible to get that train back on tracks, because why would the Iranians sign an agreement with the United States? There's an election in 2 years' time, isn't it? What's the next president going to say about this? So the bad news is that Iran is probably going to go nuclear, and it might happen even in 2023. I fear that, and this is just from my knowledge of humans, that it will take a holy shit moment before we get our act together. A moment where everybody suddenly realizes what people like myself, like Professor Harang, have been harping on for years, that we can't have nuclear weapons on hair trigger alert in this way that we have had so far. It's simply too dangerous, and I fear that this might be through the actual use of nuclear weapons. That might happen in 2023. It might be through Iran detonating a nuclear bomb, signaling that it has become a nuclear power. That might be a moment like that. So, I'm not saying that, let's, like just roll up our sleeves and let's get this done. I think that there's going to be more bad news before there is good news. But keep in mind that when that moment comes, the man or the woman with the idea, the person with a plan to how to contain this, will be in very, very high demand. And I hope that should worst come to worst, that somebody, a hero, man or woman, will rise from the dirt of this planet and exhibit the sort of vision that I believe that Alfred Nobel exhibited when instituting the Nobel Peace Prize. And we don't worship humans. We don't worship Alfred. We don't worship Daisaku Ikeda. We cherish their thoughts, and we try to bring it further into this world. And the Nobel Peace Prize has been going since 1901. It's still the award that captures the world's imagination. And I hope that as a member of this committee, I can be one of the people who contributes to the betterment of mankind.
Thank you all so much. I do feel confident in saying that I know there are people in this audience. We have a founder with ideas, so thank you for that uplifting word of hope at the end of this very rich conversation.